New Zealand has 5 million people and 10 million cows. In 2023, a Wellington family paid $8.50 for 2 liters of milk produced just 15 kilometers from their home. That same milk sold in Shanghai for 6 points. You'd think an industry this massive would be a recipe for prosperity, right? Instead, one sector has sunk its teeth so deep into the country's veins that it controls politics, dictates land use, and even decides what ordinary people can afford to eat. This isn't just farming, this is economic capture, and it raises one uncomfortable question. When did New Zealand become a nation built for cows instead of humans? New Zealand sells itself as paradise. Rolling hills, happy cows, rivers so clean you could drink from them. The kind of place travel ads call untouched. But scratch the postcard and you'll see what's underneath. An economy shackled to milk, not just any milk. An industry worth more than $22 billion, pulling the strings of exports, politics, and policy. For decades, the world has swallowed the myth of purity, while one product quietly defined an entire nation's fate. Consider this: dairy now occupies 2.6 million hectares of land. That's larger than the entire nation of Israel. The irony, a country that prides itself on freedom, is economically chained to cows. And the cost isn't just measured in dollars, it's measured in land, water, and the future itself. In Canterbury alone, nitrate levels in groundwater have increased 500% since intensive dairying began. Because when one industry grows this big, it doesn't just feed the nation, it owns it. That's the truth hiding behind the green hills and smiling dairy ads. A truth few want to admit, because the numbers tell a story even uglier than the image. If you think this sounds exaggerated, just wait until you see what's really keeping New Zealand afloat. And more importantly, what happens when the milk runs dry. The rise of the dairy empire. Once upon a time, New Zealand was a nation of sheep. Wool was king. In 1960, the country had 60 million sheep and just 2 million dairy cows. Then the 1980s happened. Rogernomics, they called it. Finance Minister Roger Douglas promised deregulation would set farmers free. The crown was quietly handed to the cow. Out of that shift rose a behemoth, Fonterra. Technically a co-op. In reality, a corporate giant in disguise. Today, this one company controls 95% of all milk exports. 95. That's not a market, that's a monopoly with a smiley logo. Here's what they don't tell you. When Fonterra formed in 2001, then Prime Minister Helen Clark had to pass special legislation exempting it from commerce laws that would have blocked such concentration of power. The irony, farmers were promised freedom and competition. Instead, they got a single gatekeeper deciding who thrives and who sinks. Take John Mackenzie, a third-generation farmer from Southland. My grandfather had options, he told me, staring at foreclosure notices. He could sell to 5 different companies. Now, it's Fonterra's price or bankruptcy. His debt, $4.2 million. His crime, believing the promise of prosperity. Politicians called it efficiency. Economists called it progress. But ordinary people, they just saw rivers choking on nitrates, communities locked to dairy prices, and a nation where one brand name carries more weight than most governments. A co-op built on the idea of farmers sharing power somehow ended up becoming the very machine they were told they'd never need to fear. Because when one player controls the game, the outcome is already written. And in New Zealand's case, the script is starting to look a lot less like prosperity, and a lot more like dependence. But absolute power never comes without absolute consequences. And those consequences? They've already begun. The numbers don't lie. New Zealand loves to market itself as forward-thinking, innovative, a modern economy ready for the future. Silicon Valley of the South Pacific, some call it. But peel back the glossy brochures, and the numbers tell a different story. Dairy alone makes up nearly 7% of GDP directly, but factor in supporting industries, and it's closer to 15%. It dominates exports at 28% of total trade. It dictates foreign trade deals. Compare that to Ireland, another small island nation. Tech represents 15% of their GDP, pharmaceuticals another 10%. Or Singapore, financial services, shipping and tech. Each claims significant chunks. Forget tech, finance, or innovation. New Zealand's economy runs on cow pee, literally. The national brand may scream clean and green, but the balance sheet says milk and manure. Every tanker leaving the farm isn't just carrying product, it's carrying the weight of an entire country's financial stability. In 2022 alone, a 5% drop in global dairy prices triggered emergency meetings in Wellington and wiped $2 billion from the economy overnight. That's not diversification. diversification. That's dependence dressed up as success. And while politicians brag about record exports, the irony is hard to miss. A nation admired for its natural beauty is surviving on a system slowly eroding the very environment it sells to the world. It's like fueling your car by siphoning from the gas tank. Effective in the short term, disastrous in the long run. Dr. Susan Krumdiek, systems engineer at Canterbury University, puts it bluntly: we've created a monoculture economy. And monocultures, whether biological or economic, always collapse. It's not if, it's when. Because you can only run on borrowed fumes for so long before the engine starts to choke. And New Zealand's economic engine, it comes with a dirty secret, one that no amount of lush green advertising can cover up. Paradise Lost, the environmental price. They called it 100% pure New Zealand. The ads showed families splashing in crystal-clear rivers, tourists kayaking through untouched wilderness. Tourism New Zealand spent $120 million annually selling this image. But step outside the brochure and test the water, and you'll find nitrates at 11.2 milligrams SLAR in Canterbury, 5 times the safe drinking limit. You'll find toxic algae blooms that killed 150 dogs between 2020 and 2023. You'll find rivers so polluted that 62% are now unswimmable. This is the hidden cost of dairy, streams turned into sewage pipes, once pristine waterways sacrificed for export dollars. The Selwyn River, once a recreational paradise, now runs dry for 6 months each year, its water diverted for irrigation. Lake Ellesmere, a former food basket for local Maori, is now so polluted that eels caught there are toxic to eat. New Zealand, the country that sells itself as nature's playground, now ranks among the worst in the OECD for water quality, 32nd out of 38 nations. That's not just a slip, it's a betrayal. The slogan still says clean and green, but only if you don't actually check the rivers. Mike Joy, freshwater ecologist at Victoria University, doesn't mince words. We're witnessing ecological collapse in real time. I've studied rivers for 30 years. Half the species I used to find are gone. Farmers were told they were feeding the world. Instead, they're poisoning their own backyard. And here's the cruelest irony. The very landscapes plastered on billboards overseas are disappearing at home, drowned in runoff and cow waste. Each dairy cow produces the waste equivalent of 14 humans. Multiply that by 10 million. It's a trade nobody voted for, but everyone pays for. Because when water is no longer safe to swim in, or even drink from, paradise stops being paradise. And if the environment is paying the price, so are the people. The debt trap, when farmers become victims. Behind the glossy image of booming dairy exports lies a darker truth. Farmers themselves are being milked dry. Sarah Chen bought into the dairy dream in 2015, converting her family's mixed farm in Waikato. The banks promised prosperity. Fonterra promised premium prices. Convert to dairy, they said, it's the future. Today she owes $4.7 million. The average dairy farm debt in New Zealand, $4.2 million. Total sector debt, over $40 billion more than some small nation's entire GDP. For families told they were joining the nation's winning industry, the reality feels more like a trap. I work 80-hour weeks, Sarah says, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. My kids barely see me. And for what? To service interest payments while Fonterra executives collect million-dollar bonuses. The tractors get bigger, the herds get larger, but so do the loans. Input costs have risen 45% since 2018. Milk payouts, up just 12%. The math doesn't work, but stopping isn't an option. The cruel irony is that the so-called backbone of the economy is often one bad season away from collapse. Rural suicide rates tell the story statistics try to hide. Farmers are twice as likely to take their own lives as urban dwellers. Behind each number is a family crushed by the weight of impossible debt and broken promises. These aren't villains, they're people locked into a cycle where stepping back means financial ruin and moving forward means more debt. They were promised independence, but ended up chained to the banks. ANZ alone holds $12 billion in agricultural loans. When one bank controls that much farm debt, who really owns the land? New Zealand loves to celebrate dairy farmers as national heroes. Yet quietly, many are drowning under the very system that was meant to lift them up. And while families fight to keep their farms alive, the industry they sustain keeps the entire country in its grip. Because even in debt, even in crisis, the cows keep milking, and the nation keeps drinking. This isn't freedom, it's captivity. And yet, despite the crushing weight of it all, the industry still holds New Zealand hostage. The China syndrome. All eggs in one basket. New Zealand calls it trade diversification. In reality, it's dependency dressed up in a nice suit. Over 43% of all dairy exports flow straight to one destination, China. In 2013, it was 15%. That's not growth, that's addiction. Nearly half the industry's lifeline is tied to a single handshake in Beijing. Remember 2013? One botulism scare, which turned out to be false.
and China shut its doors. The economy lost $300 million in 48 hours. The New Zealand dollar plummeted. Fonterra's share price crashed 20%. And here's the terrifying math. That was when China bought just 15% of exports. Now it's triple that. One political dispute, one sour deal, one shift in policy, and an economy built on milk could curdle overnight. When Beijing sneezes, New Zealand doesn't just catch a cold, it catches pneumonia. Australia learned this lesson with coal and wine. China turned off the tap, and industries worth billions evaporated overnight. Canada faced the same with canola. New Zealand watches these warnings and doubles down anyway. This isn't strategy. It's Russian roulette with 5 bullets in a 6-chamber gun. The country has built its prosperity on the assumption that China will always keep buying, always keep paying, always keep wanting more. But China is already investing heavily in its own dairy industry, with plans to be self-sufficient by 2035. What happens when that stops? What happens when your biggest customer decides they've had enough? The irony is brutal. A nation that prides itself on sovereignty has tied its fate to the whims of another. Former Prime Minister John Key admitted as much in a leaked memo. We are conscious that our economic relationship with China requires careful political management. Translation: when China says jump, New Zealand asks how high. And if you think that dependence ends at trade, think again. Because when your economy lives and dies on one buyer, politics start bending too. The addiction doesn't just warp exports, it warps decisions at the highest level. And in New Zealand's case, the line between economic survival and political compromise is already blurring. Political capture: when cows write the laws. In New Zealand, cows don't just shape the landscape, they shape the laws. Behind every proud dairy nation speech lies an industry with lobbying power most countries reserve for oil or arms. Dairy NZ spends $8 million annually on advocacy. Federated Farmers adds another $5 million. That's just the official numbers. Environmental regulations, water protections, climate pledges, time and again they're watered down or delayed because dairy is simply too big to fail. Case in point, the 2020 essential freshwater reforms. Original proposal: strict nitrate limits, mandatory destocking, real consequences. Final version: voluntary targets, decade-long transitions, and enough loopholes to drive a milk tanker through. Why? Because Fonterra's board had more meetings with ministers than environmental groups had in 5 years combined. The hypocrisy is staggering. Agricultural emissions make up 48% of the country's greenhouse gases, yet farmers remain largely exempt from the emissions trading scheme everyone else is forced to pay into. Ordinary households cough up for carbon costs on fuel and electricity, an average of $400 annually, while the biggest polluters get a political hall pass. David Parker, former environment minister, tried to change this. His reward: death threats, protests with tractors surrounding parliament, and eventually political exile. You can't fight them, he admitted off record. They own half the MPs through rural electorates. Why? Because no party wants to be the one that takes on the cow. The math is simple. Rural electorates hold disproportionate power. Anger farmers, lose government. Politicians talk tough about climate change on the world stage. Jacinda Ardern's nuclear-free moment speech rings hollow when you see the exemptions. Then come home and bow to the industry that keeps the GDP graph pointing up. Call it pragmatism. Call it cowardice. Either way, it's the same story. An economy held hostage by its own sacred cow. And while the suits in Wellington keep bending over backwards for dairy, there's one group that doesn't get exemptions: subsidies or bailouts. The people living with the consequences. And ordinary citizens, they're the ones footing the bill. The milk paradox: Kiwis can't afford their own product. Here's the kicker: New Zealand produces enough milk to feed 100 million people, yet its own people often pay more for it than shoppers overseas. Walk into a Countdown in Auckland, 5.80s for 2 liters of standard milk. Walk into a Tesco in London, where that same milk traveled 18,000 kilometers, for $250. The Robinson family in Porirua budgets $60 weekly for dairy products: milk, cheese, butter. It's insane, says mother of 3 Jane Robinson. We live 10 minutes from dairy farms, and I'm rationing milk for my kids' cereal. How does that make sense? Simple. The export dollar matters more than the local family. When global prices rise, domestic prices follow. When global prices fall, domestic prices somehow stay high. It's heads they win, tails you lose. The irony is brutal. Kiwis ship their milk to the world, then buy it back at a premium. Politicians spin it as the cost of being a trading nation. But tell that to the single parent staring down a grocery bill that keeps climbing while tankers roll out to China. Food bank demand has increased 300% since 2019. Guess what's most requested? Milk powder. The country that feeds millions abroad can't even guarantee affordable basics at home. That's not just an economic flaw, it's a moral one. Because what good is a multi-billion-dollar industry if ordinary citizens can't afford the product made in their own backyard? Fonterra's former CEO Theo Spearings earned $8.3 million in his final year. enough to buy 2.8 million liters of milk. Meanwhile, 1 in 5 Kiwi children lives in households that regularly run out of food. In the end, milk in New Zealand isn't priced for people, it's priced for markets. And while the government celebrates export records, households are left with receipts that tell a very different story. But the costs of this system don't end at the checkout, they run much deeper. White gold or fool's gold, the health deception. Dairy isn't just an export, it's a national religion. From childhood, Kiwis are taught that milk equals strength, pride, even patriotism. Schools hand out 140,000 cartons daily through Fonterra's Milk in Schools program, a $20 million gift that looks more like customer cultivation. Ads tell families that dairy is the backbone of health. 3 servings a day, they preach, while obesity rates hit 34%. But here's what they don't advertise. New Zealand has the 3rd highest obesity rate in the OECD. Type 2 diabetes affects 250,000 people in a nation of 5 million. Lactose intolerance affects up to 70% of Maori and Pacifica populations. Yet dairy remains pushed as essential nutrition. Dr. Lisa Timorenga, nutrition researcher at Victoria University, pulled back the curtain. The dairy industry funds most nutrition research in New Zealand.